Welcome back to another episode of Novelio. Today is Friday, May 28th, 2021. I'm going to continue on with my reading of Hot Winter Sun. I suppose I'll take that one part as a compliment, Julian laughed. If I could describe things as you do, I could have been the world's most successful poet or minstrel. Nay, because you would never have had the patience to set it to paper. I guess I must concede to that, he answered. On the way back, they stopped to water their horses, and for reasons Catherine didn't fully understand, the feel of his arms as he brought her down from her horse stirred an intense longing for him that she was unable to subdue. She did not immediately let go, and her expression, perhaps because it was so rare, filled him with raging desire. However, Christopher's words came back to him. You must back away and let her come to you. He forced patience as time seemed to stand still, but in what could have been no more than a second or two, she pulled him closer and whispered, Kiss me, Julian. Without hesitation, he brought his lips down passionately upon hers as his arms encircled her. You are the love of my life, Catherine, he finally said. If it weren't for broad daylight, I would have you here and now. Just then a sound came from the nearby wood, and Julian was immediately alert, as he would never forget that it was not far from this forest where his brother was shot. It turned out to be the poachers whom he wanted to thrash within an inch of their lives for causing a disturbance at that moment. But he knew it would not do Catherine any good to see him enraged over anything. How now? Get gone from here. This is not your property, he shouted to the men who immediately scurried off in another direction. Bad enough I have to put up with my own. I'm certainly not suffering the neighbors' poachers. Inwardly, he was more than furious, not only over poaching, but over the timing of the matter. He could see, too, that something was suddenly heavy on Catherine's mind. Julian, she said, looking thoughtful, it seems to be an ever-increasing problem here and among the surrounding establishments. Poaching, I mean? Yes, he replied, knowing that there was more on her mind than that banal statement. She frowned as if processing several thoughts and finally said, How possible do you think it is that Robert's murder was merely a poacher or a thief who caught him in the wrong place at the wrong time, rather than a pre-planned murder? I thought of it too. I have discussed it with Richard and Christopher too. What was the consensus? Do you think it could have been nothing more than unimaginable bad luck? It seemed to her as if Julian was quiet for a long time, and when he finally turned to face her, she knew what he was going to say before he spoke. No, love, I don't. Although the ride had been enjoyable, both Catherine and Julian felt somewhat heavy-hearted when they returned to the manor. Catherine almost regretted asking Julian the question, but she had to know his opinion. She knew in her heart that Robert's murder was much more than the random act of a lunatic, but like everyone else, her thoughts only took her in circles. She went immediately to Robert's nursery, as she always did after being out, to assure herself he was safe. She had become almost obsessed with his safety and had asked Julian if he could be guarded, and he replied at once that he would see it was done. Julian himself had taken to walking through Catherine's apartments shortly before she was to go to bed, just to determine that no one was there. He didn't want her to know he was doing so, as he feared she might misunderstand. He had also developed an almost paranoid attitude towards speaking of the situation indoors, where the conversation could be overheard. He reasoned that if it were someone in his household, which all evidence seemed to point to, it may be unsafe to speak of it anywhere else. The culprit could be nearby or even in the same room, and none would be the wiser. One day, as he paced the courtyard, Christopher asked him to go for a ride. I haven't seen the new inn yet, the one that sits back from the road a bit. I've been to it, Julian replied. They have a good stapling there. Lunch is simple, but it's wholesome and tasty. Let's go have a bite to eat and some ale then, and see if we can get anywhere with this mystery. They ordered cured ham and potatoes baked in their jackets. The cider was good, although somewhat strong, but they had very little. Do you still suspect Reginald or Blake? Christopher said. I suspect everyone, Julian replied. I've quite literally been going over every person one at a time. Have you thought of Sarah? I know she seems to adore Catherine, and I hate to think these dour thoughts about anyone, but Catherine told me how desperate she was to marry that Godfrey fellow. It's a morose idea, but do you suppose there's some underlying jealousy there? Could she have had her eye on you as a husband, and therefore want to eliminate Catherine for obvious reasons? Of course, that does not explain Robert's death. if the same person is responsible for it all. She would not kill someone she wanted to marry. Well, it's not an outlandish theory based on what you know, but what you don't know is that Sarah has built up a strange fantasy that she is actually the illegitimate daughter of my father. It's a misconception she's had for years. She believes herself my half-sister. Then that is another dead end, Christopher said, as a woman wouldn't attempt to marry her brother. She really has this odd belief that she's related to you? Julian nodded. No one has successfully been able to talk her out of it. That might produce another motive, though, Christopher said, looking thoughtful. Perhaps she has her eye on Briarwood. I know women do not generally inherit estates, but she may be thinking of it for that son from her first marriage, Nathan. That did enter my mind, although illegitimate relatives rarely inherit, which she must know. But more importantly, no attempts have been made on my life, or thank God little Robert's. We would both have to be eliminated to clear the way for Nathan, even if he was related and in line for Briarwood. It seems Catherine's the only one being targeted, and Sarah would gain no more from Catherine's death than she would have from Robert's, which is nothing. Yet, who would benefit from either of their deaths? No one has gained from Robert's death that I can see. This is what happens every time I discuss it with Paul or Richard. We work out all kinds of scenarios, but then we talk them out. We realize we've ended up nowhere again. The frustration is enough to blow a man's head off. Indeed it is. Julian began to say something, then suddenly stopped, looking somewhat surprised. Lizette Ashington is here? What on earth is she doing in a place like this? I would think it beneath her to eat where the patronage was mixed with commoners, Julian said, laughing at Lizette's snobbishness. Oh, that's Garth Pilkington with her, Christopher said. I've seen her with him before over the last few years. I just didn't know who she was then. As always, he will introduce her as a cousin, but her real position is far less respectable. He's evidently not cut from fine enough cloth to marry, but apparently is satisfactory in at least one way. This right under my nose, and all the while she's looking to Robert once and now to me as a potential husband? How did you come to find this out? Christopher looked about for a few seconds and then said quietly, You would be surprised to know, in my line of work, it is easy to cross paths with people one would never expect to see in certain situations. 'Tis a lot of tongue-biting a man must endure to do the job I do. Julian shook his head, amazed. Living next to the Ashingtons for years now, he had never noticed her out of her element, but could see it from across the room that she was flirting gaily with the young man, and he responded in kind. How little we know about each other, Julian said. Have you thought of her, Lizette? Christopher asked at length. Again, it seems incongruous, but there is a motive there that does not involve monetary gain, rather jealousy and the desire to wed. From what Carinza told me one day, Lizette was fixated on you twins since she met you. Carinza told you that? Julian said, amused. I suppose everyone has seen Lizette's forwardness on that matter. You'd think the women would be embarrassed at this point. He looked at her again and then turned to the younger man. But is she a killer, Christopher? And why would she kill Robert? A woman scorned? I'm not saying it's impossible, but does she seem absolutely mad to you? To me she does not, but perhaps I can't reason anything properly anymore. She does seem an unlikely suspect, but then they all do. That's the problem. I lead myself back to a mad Puritan such as Reginald or Blake. But their alibis, Julian began. I know. I feel as if we are almost forced to wait and catch the person in the act, but that seems a risky path to take. I confess, though, I don't know what else we could do at this point other than take every single family member, servant, neighbor, and friend in it and interrogate them, which would only result in us appearing mad ourselves. And after this, I must be off. This is the one time I am tempted to lay down my last mission and remain here. It would do no good, Julian sighed. Look at how futile this afternoon has been. If you stayed, it would only be more of the same. Circular conversations that led nowhere and accomplished nothing. He shook his head in frustration, and the two men rose. Julian was not looking forward to another dinner, but these soirees were being planned to give cover to the men who wanted to gather and discuss war matters under the guise of a social gathering. Jennifer and Catherine liked such occasions for Carinza's sake, whom they worried about continuously. Most of the guests had arrived and been shown to their rooms while Julian and Christopher were out, and it was almost time for supper when they finally made their way to the main hall. Catherine thought Julian looked especially handsome that night and noticed with a smile that he was in one of Robert's outfits. She remembered how angry she was when he had mistakenly wore his clothes on that long-ago day in the graveyard. She thought with amazement how things had changed in less than 2 years. She also couldn't help but notice Carissa looking particularly attractive that night. She found it peculiar, as parties typically never gave Carissa the urge to shine, except during that unfortunate affair with Harold. "You look absolutely beautiful, Carrie," Catherine said. "I think you should wear that pale blue more often. It is a perfect foil to your dark hair." Carissa responded graciously and commented that Julian and Christopher seemed to have become really good friends. "It is almost as if Christopher has become a surrogate brother. It touches me," she said, smiling at Julian. Catherine wondered if Carissa still entertained romantic thoughts about Julian and hoped once again that she would never be the cause of another woman's unhappiness. Not surprisingly, conversation at the dinner table was all about the war. The Roundheads are now in Launceston. News came today that Hopton surrendered in mid-March, Christopher said. Sir Thomas Fairfax had led the new model army to a great victory near Truro. The battle was fought near Tressalian Bridge and virtually reversed the great victories enjoyed by the King's army in Cornwall for so long. None were happy to receive the news, but few could say they were surprised. "What will happen now?" Carissa asked him. "Pendennis Castle will be besieged by the Parliamentarians." "No," said Jennifer, "but that would mean the Western Royalist army would have to disband." "It means the end," Paul said. "Cornwall is in denial," Christopher said. "It was not winnable since the new model army took over and the Battle of Naseby lost. More bloodshed will come, as these few castles insist on holding out. We must prepare to leave." After the guests were in the winter parlor having brandy, Julian went to his study to fetch a letter he wanted to show Paul and Christopher, but it was not long before he heard a hesitant rap on his door, followed by a more confident knock. "Well, you do not have to stare at me as if I were some poisonous thing," Lizette said when he opened the door. "Lizette, when will you realize I have no fancy for you? I'm sure you can find what you're looking for elsewhere. But you must stop this flagrant behavior with me. You mew like a kitten, but I think you're a beast at heart, so you'd best find more vulnerable prey." It was a cool dismissal, and she resented it. She grabbed him suddenly and attempted to kiss him with passion, but he took her arms forcibly from his neck and pushed her away. You weary me with this carrying on, and I am tired of dealing with it, especially under my own roof. I have no interest in you. There was never anything between you and I. There is now, and there never will be. So stop making a fool of yourself and leave me alone. Even if I was not in love with Catherine, I would not want you. Go have a brandy with the rest, or perhaps go back to the inn where you were earlier with your companion." "You unimaginable bastard. I've given you the facts, Lizette. Try to face them." And with this, he shoved her out of the door. The others could not understand the reason for Lizette's foul mood for the rest of the evening, and even the servants stayed out of her way. At one point she almost collided with Clarissa as she came around the corner to the great hall and snapped at the little girl unnecessarily. She told her to watch where she was going, and Clarissa had answered, "It is precisely because I was watching my steps that we didn't crash right into each other. I suggest you pay a bit more attention to your own surroundings." From now on, Lizette ranted to Paul about the girl, but Paul laughed to himself, thinking that if anyone thought they could duel with Clarissa and come out the winner, that person was not very bright. Shortly thereafter, Lizette suddenly seemed very pleased with herself, almost as if she had solved a problem or come up with a solution for something she was unhappy about. Acting as if she were hugging from some secret, she entered the drawing room where Catherine was playing the lute. "She plays so well," Carissa was saying to Christopher. "Was it your mother who taught her?" "I suppose that's a silly question," she said before Christopher had a chance to answer. "It certainly wasn't your father." At this, the two had a hearty laugh, and Christopher told Carissa and a few of the ladies standing nearby how their mother worked on the stage and the various instruments she'd learned. Later that night, Catherine went to the kitchens to see if the staff were keeping up with the guests or if additional help was needed. She found that everything was well under control and was slowly making her way back to the main party when she heard a commotion in one of the side rooms. Apparently others had heard it as well, as Julian, Paul, and Carissa were coming from the other end of the hall. Upon entering one of the smaller solariums, they saw Lizette in some state of disarray, and Catherine briefly wondered if she had managed to bring Damien to the party and was now on the receiving end of one of his drunken fiascos. It took her a moment to understand what was happening when she heard the dialogue. but suddenly realized, as did everyone else, that Lizette was accusing Christopher of attacking her. Before anyone could speak, however, Clarissa emerged from the shadows, startling all who stood there. "Christopher didn't do anything wrong. I saw what happened. I was over there." Clarissa pointed to a small alcove just off the solarium. "The other room became too hot and my head began to ache, so I went to my hiding place, as Matthew calls it, to sit down for a moment, and I heard the entire episode." Lizette was the one bothering Christopher. Julian looked sharply at Lizette, who had suddenly become pale. Then, as fast as the color had drained, it rushed again to her cheeks and spread down her neck. "What have you to say, Lizette?" Julian demanded angrily. "The child is obviously lying," Lizette replied haughtily, but both Julian and Paul could see her nervousness. "You have done some despicable things, Lizette," Julian said, "but this is the worst I have seen from you. I do not understand. How can you so easily lie and slander another person who has done nothing to you?" "Exactly," Lizette said. "What on earth would my motive be to say that Christopher was forcing his intentions on me if he wasn't? Do you think I'm insane that I would just make up a story to create drama at a party?" Her indignant tone belied her nervousness as she looked from Julian to Richard, both of whom noticed she could not meet Christopher's eyes. "Tell it all, Clarissa," Julian said. Clarissa looked at her older sister, who nodded to her. Lizette was putting her arms around Christopher, and he was pulling himself away. She was trying to kiss him, and he was untangling himself from her arms. But she kept on. "This is outrageous," Lizette cried. "The child has no idea what she's talking about. She's too young to even know of such matters." "I certainly know what a kiss is. I am not as naive as all that," Clarissa replied hotly, and flushed a darker shade than Lizette. "Continue, Clarissa," Julian said calmly. "I don't understand everything he said, but she got angry and slapped him hard across the face and began to yell and make this commotion. I was here the whole time. It was not Christopher who made her so untidy. She did that to her own hair and gown." "She's not lying," Julian said simply, and he looked at Lizette so coldly that for a moment Richard thought he meant to do her harm. "Get out of my home and don't return. You're no longer welcome at Briarwood." "You cannot be serious," Lizette replied, laughing indignantly. "The word of a mere child, a blacksmith's child at that." She made a point to look at Catherine and then continued, "And a man you've only known for a few months at best? You are ridiculous, Julian. You know I am telling the truth." "Yes, it is precisely because I know you that I do not believe you." He turned to Clarissa. "Lizette is what is called a woman of loose moral character, although decent fellows refuse to say that in public." "Julian," Richard said. "I don't care, Richard." He turned to Lizette once more. "Shall I escort you out? I would happily do so at this moment." "Let's go, Lizette," Paul said, finally finding his voice. "Get your things and let's go." Lizette gave Julian a look that to Catherine seemed positively malicious and stormed from the room. Paul walked over to where Christopher was standing. "I apologize for my sister. This is by far the worst thing she has ever done. I don't know what to say. My father is as frustrated with her as I am, and he has asked me to take her in hand a bit, but I fear I've done little or nothing to control her antics. In truth, I feel as if I am incapable of handling her and am at a loss as what to do other than extend my heartfelt apology, but I will make amends in any way you want." Christopher immediately offered his hand to the other man and said, "I'm well pleased these accusations weren't believed, and asked no more than that." When Paul and Lizette left, Carissa suddenly cried, "How I detest that woman! She is a loathsome creature and should not be welcomed in any proper home. How could she have sunk to this level?" I know, said Richard. "We best all calm down. Paul is taking her home. I agree, though. Her behavior seems more and more outrageous as time goes on." "Outrageous! It's criminal," Carissa said. "A man's reputation can be destroyed over something like this, and what did Catherine or Christopher ever do to her? She's a contemptible person. I'm glad you threw her out." Carissa turned to Julian. "You should have done it a long time ago." And with this, she left the room. "She is quite angry," Clarissa said. "She does not care much for Lizette." "No," said Julian, "there is certainly no love lost there." When Clarissa left the room, Julian told Richard how Lizette did her best to ruin the romantic interlude between Carissa and Harold Montgomery. "Now to witness this," he said. "She is fed up with the girl, as we all are. Lord knows there is enough going on in this household without someone such as her making completely unnecessary scenes." When Jennifer heard what happened, she offered to take Clarissa and Matthew back to Grantley Estates with them for the short amount of time they would all still be in Cornwall. There is so much unrest in this house right now, she added. I know. I'm a bit concerned for them. Since you are going away, a little respite for the two might be good before the tumult of this war sends us all into exile. I would love to do it. It will seem so lonely at Grantley after this extended stay at Briarwood. I'm sure Carinsa can quickly catch them up on their lessons upon their return. She may even enjoy going to Grantley to give some lessons there, Catherine said. It could be a distraction for her and allow her a bit of time to forget about the whole Harold incident as well. Later, Paul told Julian that he was heartily impressed with Christopher and wished that more people in the world were like Catherine and her brother. Julian had replied that if that were the case, perhaps they would not be in the middle of a civil war, and Paul earnestly agreed. Later that week, more news of the very war made its way to Cornwall, and at lunch one day, a visiting general said that Sir Thomas Fairfax had urged the prince to surrender to Parliament. After enjoying Jennifer and Richard's last dinner at Briarwood, Julian went off in search of Catherine. He knew shortly they would be leaving their home and country to head into the unknown and felt as if he needed her more than ever. The gardens are lovely right now, Catherine. Let's slip away and find a quiet corner. I want you to myself. If he were more crudely honest, he also would have admitted that her appearance in the candlelit room in her deep red gown filled him with a roaring lust. He took her hand and they left the great room and walked along the garden path where the trees reached out to a velvet blue sky and the half-moon shone silver on the pond. It was a picturesque night, but Catherine was aware of little except the man at her side. Do come to me, Kathy. I can't wait any more for you. You're driving me to distraction. I see so much of what my brother loved. Let's not torment ourselves any longer. She stopped to view the pond, and he wrapped his arms around her and pulled her back against him. Your arms feel good about me, Julian. I think I should not be here tonight. Somehow my word ceases to exist when you are this close to me. You mesmerize me, and yet there's someone else? You know I've never had a lover save Robert. You think I'll hurt you. You can't get past your fear that I'm some demon lover who will use you for my own purposes and then cast you off. I do not think this, Julian, she said, turning around and interlacing her fingers with his. How exquisite she was, as if God set out to create the perfect woman. Aye, but you do, sweetheart, and I swear to you it is safe to put these fears to rest, for I promise it wouldn't be as some game to me. You would not merely be a conquest, someone to be used and discarded, for I know that it is what you fear of me. You think I cannot be different with you because of what you call a rakish past, but I promise there is one for whom I could be so gallant a lover, and she is you. Her gaze met his, and in a rare moment, rare for her indeed, he could read her expression explicitly. It was that of a woman in love, and he watched her resolve melt away to nothingness as he swept her softly and lovingly into his arms. He knew then how correct Christopher had been, that fear, not hardness, was the author of these walls that were now crumbling between them, and that gentleness, not aggression, was the key that had finally unlocked her. It was just past midnight when Catherine made her way to Julian's room. He was not there, and when she slipped in the door, and she curled up in a chair near the fireplace and gazed at the flame. How often Julian had said to her that he could not wait any more, and now it was she who had no resistance, and her soul that must have relief. She was overwhelmed with feelings of passion and desire. Thoughts of this man who she loved consumed her every waking moment. If I cannot satisfy this fire in my heart and body, I shall go insane. When he entered the room and saw her there, he struggled against the urge to rush to her and sweep her into his arms and bed. You're here at last, he said softly. He almost expected her mask to quickly restore itself, but her gaze did not waver, nor did her expression change. It was love and desire smoldering in her eyes as it had been under the moonlight a few hours prior. He removed his cloak in a single gesture of easy grace, tossed it aside, and reached out to her with both hands. She placed hers in his and stood to her feet, yet still he waited, even though the pressure was unbearable. I love you so much, Julian, she whispered, her palms sweeping over his chest and shoulders. She took his face in her hands, inviting him to kiss her, which he promptly did. You are the love of my life, Cat. I've never loved like this before, and I never will again." She placed her arms around his neck as if she knew what he would do next, and she was right. He swept her up and carried her to his bed, thinking only of his all-consuming need for her. "You make a man helpless, Catherine. How I lived without you this long I will never know," he said, acknowledging to himself that no woman had ever come close to having the effect Catherine had on him. She spoke so often of how he overwhelmed her. If she only knew the power she wielded over him in that moment. Her body under his, the warmth of her skin between his fingers, the silky texture of her long golden hair made him feel like a man intoxicated. Never would he get enough of her. He did not remember how they managed to discard their clothes or how long it was before they melted into each other in overwhelming passion, only that time stood still and as suddenly they were together as he knew they were meant to be for so long. Catherine felt as if her heart and body and soul no longer belonged to her and wondered why she had waited so long and denied herself so much. At times, during that long romantic night, she was back in Robert's arms, and then he was once again Julian, and her heart belonged to them both in a surreal and fantastic way. And here was Julian, hers completely warm and living, and she loved him with every ounce of her being. Afterward, she lay against him, and his soul was filled with the enormous peace that came from having her in his arms at long last. Holding her, just feeling her lying there was enough for that moment. "This is paradise," he thought drowsily. "You are a passionate girl, my Kathy," he said later. "You devoured every kiss and touch." "You must always say something shocking," she replied. "You don't even realize how rare you are. Such a correct and proper woman on all occasions, but a wildcat underneath. I'm mesmerized. My cat has fierce fangs after all." Finally, she propped herself up on one elbow. "You are beside yourself," she said. "I like when you make fun of me. I guess I will be beside myself for a lifetime. You are a unique and enchanting woman. You've had this passion for me for a long time, for it to unleash so strong all at once. How you hold everything in. Of course, in this case, it worked in my favor. This night was heaven on earth. I certainly never thought to get you here, yet here you are and seem well pleased to be so. Something changed. I don't know what it was. I let you come on your own terms. Something I should have done long ago." The next morning, Catherine felt as if the entire household knew what happened, but of course they did not. She went to the stables, planning to take a solitary ride and consider the momentous change that had just occurred in their relationship. However, when she arrived, she discovered that Julian was already there. "I thought perhaps you were planning a ride," he said, "and I didn't want you to set off without me. I saw something troubled you at breakfast. It is not what I had hoped to see on your face this morning. Don't I make you happy? You are perfect in every way. It is not you, it's me. Don't build walls of fear again. Tell me what it is. Get it out in the light of day before it takes root. You must not be impatient with me, Julian. Some things are difficult to say. You are always probing my inner thoughts. You should stop doing this. Except that your inner thoughts are what worry me most. I never know what you are thinking or how to read your expression, and it makes me uneasy. I can't always live with this fear of losing you, Kathy. It is unfair to me. Tell me what is so deeply on your mind that it actually showed on your face. I felt when we were together last night that it was almost like having Robert back. Although I love you for yourself stronger than I ever thought I could, but it was as if the past and present merged together and I was with you both. Are you pleased now that I have said what is on my mind? Or will you ever realize that there is a time for silence? Will you hold this against me? There are no words to describe how much I love you, was his only reply. Julian, that is not an answer. She turned away from him in frustration, but he quickly pulled her back into his arms. I treasure your words because they are honest and sincere, and there should be no guilt on your part for feeling as you do. Of course you loved us both, sweetheart. You always will. Sometimes when you look at me, you will see him, which is something I will always welcome. Just as he likely knew, although he would never have told you, that sometimes saw me when you looked at him, especially in those days that are so long ago now, before I drove you away. It was always the three of us in some way, wasn't it? Your mind will never separate us entirely, and I am well contented to have it that way. Feeling utterly overwhelmed, yet relieved, Catherine suddenly, uncharacteristically, burst into tears. You keep too much inside, sweetheart. It's not good for you. It's an unhealthy way to live. It will cause you great distress in the future, and will distress me as well. Mark my words." He was serious about the future, but Catherine felt only the relief of the present.